Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name's Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Health Care Needs out of the Weisman Center. This is what has turned into somehow a weekly program where we try to have a nice casual place for families and organizations and educators and providers to come together and talk about issues, talk about challenges, talk about good things that are happening in the community of children and youth with special health care needs. Want to remind everybody that we are being recorded right now, so please avoid any personal identifiable health information or personal information that you do not want out on the web. Appreciate that. Also, as a reminder, I am not a lawyer or a doctor, and so none of this should be misconstrued as professional advice. We are people having a conversation and trying to help each other out. So with that being said, I am so totally excited for today's conversation. And so we have Alicia Reinhard here from numerous things. I'll let her introduce herself. So then you introduce yourself, Alicia, and then we'll talk about what we're here to talk about today. So you go ahead.
Sounds perfect. Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. For those of you who I don't know, I see some familiar names. My name is Alicia Reinhard. I am the statewide transition and graduation consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. I also oversee the Transition Improvement Grant, which some of you may have heard of before, and then get the opportunity to collaborate regularly with wonderful groups and folks like Tim and the regional health centers. So we are here today, Tim, to talk about a recent memo that the department released to schools around the responsibility for transition planning during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to let you say a few words.
There's a pandemic? What?
Yeah.
Oh, somebody should have told me. So yes, our lives have been turned upside down. The education world has been turned upside down, and we've had teachers and families trying to work together to really get the education, everything done in a whole new way that they've never experienced before. So I appreciate the fact that the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction has put out numerous helpful documents and memos to try to help schools along. And so this one on the special education transition requirements during COVID-19, as I was looking it over, there were a couple of things that came to mind. One, COVID-19 did not put the requirement for free and appropriate education on hold, what's known as FAPE, is that didn't just stop, as it continued on, as education continued on. And then two, it talked about this thing called compensatory services. Now, can you talk a little bit about either the fact that special education didn't just stop because we stopped meeting in person or because we're doing hybrid, it's still there. And what is this memo saying about compensatory services?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just dropped in the chat, just in case anyone is interested, a copy of the memo. I'll take a step back and recognize that the memo was written in collaboration with some of our transition stakeholders from the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, DVR, and our partners at the Department of Health Services in long-term supports for people with disabilities, and some divisions represented there as part of DHS. And we really felt like it was important to send a united message to schools to exactly what you just referenced a minute ago, Tim, is that the requirement to provide a free and appropriate public education, and part of that education is transition, has not been waived during the pandemic. That requirement exists. And so it's really important for school districts and families and whole IEP teams and stakeholders to collaborate and discuss how a student is going to continue to receive FAPE, continue to receive services and an education that will help them to continue to make progress if they're learning at home, if they're learning on a computer, if they're learning in a school building a couple hours a day. We all know that that looks very, very different day to day, and which part of the state you're in and which district you're in. And sometimes that even looks different student to student within a district.
Exactly. Student to student, sometimes day to day, week to week, it can look different. And so this whole flexibility has increased immensely.
Sure. And then, so one thing that the three my partners at the other departments and I really felt was important was just to remind school districts that everyone's kind of been in survival mode the last year, right? It's like, let's just get through this minute, or let's just get through this next transition plan, or let's just get through this next, 2-week quarantine we're going through right now. We have to keep in the back of our minds that students are going to graduate at the end of this school year. They are going to reach a maximum age where they cannot return to school anymore. And so we need to continue to have those collaborative conversations and enact plans and instruction and experiences so students can have positive outcomes when they leave. So then the other thing you mentioned that's in the memo, Tim, is about compensatory services. And so you may have heard staff from the department use 2 different words to describe that topic lately. We've used compensatory services and we've used additional services. And the reason that there's 2 vocabulary words out there about the same thing is because we really felt like the pandemic created a new need. So let's step back for a second and talk about compensatory services. So compensatory services are services that a school district has a responsibility to provide after there's been a gap in service for a student with an IEP for whatever reason. A good example might be maybe a student with special healthcare needs had a time period, they had an acute healthcare issue and they missed school for a month. And during that time, they were unable to engage in special education services. There would be a responsibility on the school district. Perhaps this is an IEP team decision on if that's the case, but there may be a possibility that the services missed during that time had an impact on the student and they've lost skills or they've regressed in skills and they need to make up those services that they missed. And so in that situation, a school district would provide compensatory services, or kind of like working backwards, makeup services for services that were missed. And often compensatory services can also come into play when a school district has not provided FAPE to a student. And maybe the Department of Public Instruction has been part of a complaint investigation where a school district was, found to not be providing FAPE or not providing the services that are in the student's IEP. And so they'll need to work backwards and provide those compensatory services. So now let's kind of shift to additional services and what we've really been describing in the pandemic of school districts' responsibility to provide additional services. At the department, we felt like it was really important to distinguish that this pandemic happened to every school district in Wisconsin. The governor shut down schools. I think probably we're days away from the year anniversary where he said, on Monday we're closing school, and that was like a Thursday, and by Friday everybody was closed, right? To just respond to the way that the pandemic was growing and expanding. And so it wasn't a situation where a school district was at fault for not providing those services because it was a public health emergency and nobody was getting services for a period of time. Now, we've been in this for an entire year, and this situation has evolved and changed many times. And so that is why we kind of shifted to talking about school districts providing additional services and making that global consideration for every student with an IEP while the statewide order was in effect, that what services did students not receive during that time? And do we need to provide extra to make sure that they get the services they need to continue to make progress and have access to the general education curriculum? So I might just pause there because I kind of went through a lot of details and I'm wondering if any questions are coming up for folks.
If you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or you can put them into the chat box. We are keeping an eye on all of that. So please feel free. And if I seem to go on and you have unmuted yourself, please just yell and I will, take immediate notice of that.
I have a question about additional services, if I could ask.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Is that an IEP team decision, or is that something that it's acceptable to receive a letter from an IEP team member saying that they've concluded your student does not qualify for additional services?
So it is an IEP team decision. So the school district should conduct an IEP meeting where the decision was made and information and evidence was discussed on whether or not a student would benefit from additional services. In response to the original school closure, we asked that school districts complete that in the first 6 months of the school year. So that time has come and gone. And so it would be our hope that absolutely every school district has completed that for every student, made that determination. Now that the year has kind of ebbed and flowed, there may be more individual instances where school districts need to discuss if a student needs additional services again. So for example, if a student had an exposure and was quarantined for 2 weeks and could not receive a service in their IEP virtually, or for whatever reason it just didn't work during that 2-week quarantine time, there may need to be another consideration by the IEP team that if the student needed additional services again based to that gap in service. To get back to your original question, without knowing more, I can't say totally yes or no if the letter was appropriate, but if you feel like an IEP team meeting wasn't held and you did not provide input on that, then that's probably not following what they should have done, and we can talk about some options. Do you have more follow-up questions to that?
Thank you. That is what happened from that a letter was sent to us with the recommendation saying no, we don't, or it was speech therapy, did not feel additional services were needed. And in the letter, it offered that this could be discussed in an IEP meeting. So the determination was made, and if we wanted to talk about it, we could do an IEP meeting.
Okay. So, I mean, there's a couple options you have if you're interested in kind of having a next step after that. Sometimes parents are like, this is just really overwhelming and we might need to move on to a different priority, right? If you feel like you want to have an IEP meeting, you obviously have the right as a parent to request an IEP meeting at any time, and the school district needs to respond and host an IEP meeting. The other choice would be if you feel like the school district did not follow procedures and your student did not receive the services that they should have received, then we have 3 options the department called the dispute resolution options. And one of those is to file a formal complaint with the department where they will investigate whether or not the school district followed all the procedures that they needed to determine additional services. And I see Tim is on it and he is dropping the additional or the dispute resolution options in the chat right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'd like to just point out is just reinforce what you said, is that parents can ask for an IEP meeting at any time. It's their partners in their child's education. And if the school says something and the parents don't feel they've been communicated correctly or well enough, or they don't understand, then ask for the IEP team to meet so that everybody can be on the same page. Is schools, I know, don't want parents not understanding about what the decision was for and what's going to happen. Is they want the parents to understand what's happening, and the parents want to know what's happening and why it's happening. And so that's why, convening that IEP team to get everybody back onto the same page, understanding what are the goals and what are the steps that we're going to take to get to those goals is very valuable.
What other questions might be coming up for folks on additional services versus compensatory services?
I am not seeing anybody unmuting or putting anything in the chat at this time.
Okay.
So feel free if you have some more stuff about the memo and about, additional services, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before I kind of move on to the second half of the memo, where we talk more specifically about things we encourage to support transition during this school year, I think I'm going to pull it up here and share. First, I'll drop it in the chat. A really great resource that one of our grant partners, the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative, developed to help families prep for additional services conversation. So I just dropped a link to that in the chat. And I'm going to share my screen so we can look at the document together. Just make sure you can see it says WISPY at the top, right, Tim?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. So this is just a really short guide, 2 pages on 8 things that a family can do to prep for an additional services conversation. You may have already had these conversations this year, but you might have to have more. As we kind of, a lot of schools are starting to return to more full-time instructional models here in the 4th quarter. And so it may be appropriate to have another conversation about additional services. So some things I wanted to highlight. There's some really great questions for you to consider. Helping to organize your child's records of sort of what learning has looked like during this time might be really helpful. Writing down observations. What does learning look like for your student in whatever learning model you're in right now? If you're virtually learning, what are the barriers? What things are going well? I've talked to some parents who've said, this has been great for our student. We want to stay virtual until they graduate because they're just making so much more progress. And for other students, it's really not working at all. And so there really needs to be an individualized decision. Think about challenges, think about areas of need, focus on your child's needs. Think about those disability-related needs that come up in your student's IEP. And maybe the pandemic has created new disability-related needs that we need to practice or work on. For example, it may be some time before we move away from having requirements to wear extra protective equipment like masks. And so if that's still something that your student needs to practice because they have been learning in a virtual environment for a long period of time, those may be new needs to address in an IEP or in additional services. Figure out what communication is going to work best and how often to communicate with your school, who's your key people that you want to communicate with, and who are those people when you're having trouble communicating with that you go to next. I always like to help families kind of identify, like, I'm really struggling to get a response from maybe the teacher or the principal. Okay, who's the next person who can support that conversation? Maybe you need to reach out to a head principal of a school, or maybe you need to reach out to a director of special education. And then some things to celebrate. What is your student looking forward to most when you resume a regular school schedule? Can we make sure that happens when we go back to school, to really encourage engagement and excitement about returning to school? And then anything else that you feel is important for the team to know. Any questions on that document? Okay. So then the last part of the memo that I really felt like was important for us to highlight yet today was some recommendations that the joint group of departments made to school districts. And there really is one key recommendation that we feel is critical to supporting any family and student to be successful in a transition right now, and that is collaboration. Go ahead, Tim.
Alicia, before you go on, I do want to just pose a question to
Yeah.
you. So going back to the school identifying with the parent about additional services,
Mm-hmm.
If a parent was told that their child qualified for additional service for academics, but the school said, well, we really feel this should be done in person, and the parents weren't comfortable with their child being seen in person due to medical or health issues.
Mm-hmm.
And then the school district responded back with, the parent declined additional services. It seems to me that the parents weren't declining the services. They just didn't want the child exposed in person. So is that a case where they should reconvene an IEP team or look at the resolution options?
In that situation, I think 2 things. One, I think it's important that the parent feels heard and that they feel like all options were exhausted with the school district. And so there may be an opportunity to reconvene an IEP team meeting and talk about, what, medically it is just not safe for our child to be in person, and let's talk about options. Maybe you might consider the weather's changing. Could you consider some instruction outside? Would you feel more comfortable with that? Could you consider some virtual instruction or even some training with a parent who could then facilitate instruction at home? Because maybe the parent can more easily social distance in that kind of setting than maybe a student can. So, I would think first, really make sure that you have had that collaborative conversation with your IEP team and you feel like all of the options to provide additional services had been exhausted. If the bottom line came that, it really is best for this student to receive these additional services in person, and it's not safe for the student to do so at this time, and the family's not comfortable with it, then I think there needs to be a pause in that conversation about additional services, and then it is revisited, and that determination is revisited when this health situation has changed. So I would expect the IEP team to make a plan for that. So, okay, we're going to revisit this conversation in 6 weeks, or we're going to revisit this conversation after the student has had access to a vaccine, or a family has access to a vaccine. It would be very individualized what that communication plan and when that revisit plan would look like. But the parent saying that the student can't be available for in-person instruction does not nullify the school district's need to provide those additional services in the future.
Thank you.
Any questions in the chat? I'm seeing a chat up, but I can't open it right now with sharing.
That's okay. I am keeping an eye on it. And
Okay,
I
perfect.
think we are good to go.
Okay, so I'm just gonna jump back to the memo for a second and talk about what the 3 agencies really felt was critical for transition and IEP teams to focus on during the, really the last quarter of the school year here, and that is collaboration. I think in some ways we've had more collaboration during the pandemic because it's much easier sometimes to connect with folks over a virtual channel, and everyone has now had much more experience and practice using virtual platforms to connect. But in other ways, we may feel much more disconnected from those critical resources and transition stakeholders that are a part of our students' transition from school to adulthood. And so the departments felt like it was really important for IEP teams to continue to have transition conversations, continue to have transition meetings. A lot of teams, in a typical school year at this time of year, they might be meeting once a month, talking about the student's transition from school to adulthood, or even more often, kind of depending on the student's needs. And so whichever way possible, we encourage that collaboration continues and is probably even more robust than it has been in the past, because we just have more factors to consider. The team might also consider, is the transition going to be extended a bit from what might be in a normal school year so that this transition is smoother? Do we need more time to work with these adult services before school is officially done? That would be another additional services, or it might even fall into some extended school year. You might hear a school district call it, where they may provide services a bit longer past the end of the school year to help support that successful transition for students. And so at the end of the memo, we included a few resources, mostly for professionals, but I think families may be interested in them too, from each agency about supporting transition and supporting students in the environments that each agency supports during this time. So I'll just kind of briefly show folks those, and I can drop them in the chat here as I talk about them. Oh, my chat's being funny. Where is it? It's hidden. There it is. Okay, so the first resource is a Padlet that the Transition Improvement Grant put together way back last spring, mostly for teachers, but I think there's a lot of great resources in here for families around just providing transition services and supports in a virtual format. So there's great resources in here with everything from virtual workouts to, you'll see several DPI documents of questions and answers, and more protocol and if you do have questions about, what is a school district's responsibility during this time. The second page is the transition resource page for the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, or DVR. DVR is still out there. They're still supporting students. They still need student referrals. Their referrals are down a lot. I think because, again, A lot of us are just getting through the day to day, right? But they are a critical partner in helping a student transition from high school and into employment. And so we want to make sure that families know that DVR is out there and a support for students in transition. And if you're not connected with DVR, ask your teacher about getting connected with DVR, and they can help you. Plus, there's more information on this page as well. And then the last resource is a bit more guidance. This is specifically from the Department of Health Services, and actually specifically on this page, you'll see it does cover childcare centers as well. But this is guidance for school districts about how to handle bringing kids back into the school building and managing the spread of COVID-19. And, just this has been updated throughout the pandemic when critical conversations and questions are coming up about how teachers and students are returning back to school. So that is the big parts of the memo that I wanted to go through today. What else is coming up?
Alicia, I've had the chance to check out a lot of those key resources and contacts, and they are some of the really go-tos. I have sent parents also to that. That Padlet is just fantastic because it has different categories in the ways we think about our children. I generally think about, okay, employment. Okay, yeah, what do I have questions about that? And then social emotional needs, health. So I like the way that is laid out. So I have sent parents to check out that Padlet. So I'm glad that is publicly available. But all these are just really good resources for people that want to dig a little bit deeper and have some of those questions.
Yeah, I would agree. And a good place to start if you have a question, if you have a specific question, these are kind of like key spots where we're storing information for each agency. And so, start there, and you may not find the answer to the question. And that's why we have folks like Tim and I who are here to support questions as well. So you're always welcome to reach out to any of the agencies, but this is a really good place for folks to start too.
So I guess that is a general, I just made me think of a general question that if families have questions about transition, and besides going to their, especially in education, besides going to if there is a transition coordinator, or whoever's serving as transition coordinator for their school or their school place, what other resources are out there for families?
There is a wealth of resources. So I think first off, I think of some of our grant partners. So the Transition Improvement Grant and the Wisconsin Statewide Parent, or WISPE, the Statewide Parent and Educator Initiative. WISPE has coordinators on their staff who are parents who've had kids go through transition, and they have parents who have kids in transition right now. So they're just some of the best resources because they've lived it, they've breathed it, they've supported families through it as well. So WISPE, I think, is a great resource. The Transition Improvement Grant has 9 coordinators who work all over the state and who, have been transition teachers themselves. Primarily, our work is supporting teachers and administrators in the field on training and best practices in transition, but we love to talk with parents. We love to help them learn and understand the process. And then always the department is here for parents and families. I don't know, sometimes I'll talk to parents when they do end up reaching out to our team, and they'll say, I didn't realize that the special education team had a whole team of people who are here as resources for us. And that is truly one of our main missions and priorities as a team, is we are there to support teachers and administrators, but we're there just as much to support students and families. And so my entire team at DPI and my colleagues, we have every school district in the state divided up, and everyone represents a certain group of school districts. And so you can submit questions to the special education team either through our general email or our phone number, which I can drop here in the chat in just a second. And then those questions will get sent to people just like me. Or one of my colleagues too, and we can help start you on the path of getting resources. We can help you on the path of resolving a conflict, and we can connect you with experts. So, I focus on transition and graduation, but maybe you really have a question around mental health supports, Or maybe you really have a question about, a complaint, and if your child's rights have been violated. Well, great. I have colleagues who focus on mental health. I have colleagues who focus on complaint investigations. And so we have a wealth of knowledge, and we really do. I can say it's part of one of my favorite parts of my job is continuing to connect to students and families and supporting the transition, even though I used to work in a building downtown, but now I work in my guest room. Even though I am not in a school building anymore, I still get a chance to impact those transitions. So.
And I like the way that you were able to redo your wall to match the
Yeah,
DPI
it's
colors. I
very
think
fancy, isn't
that
it?
covering, that painting was very, very well done. I am very impressed with the remodel.
I wish I was that creative to
Yeah,
really have the
yeah,
background
same
look
here.
like that.
Yeah,
So.
same here. So any other questions about the memo, about transition services moving forward, especially with COVID and the I guess what can only be described as an ever-changing landscape, as it depends on, I mean, there's changes occurring within families, within schools, within communities. I think we've all learned to step lightly because we don't know where the next step is going to take us.
Yep.
So we just have to be flexible and gracious with each other.
For sure.
And Deb, I believe, has a question. Go ahead, Deb.
Yes, thank you. I've really enjoyed your presentation, Alicia, and thank you, Tim, for making these possible. Professionally, I participate in some of the CYSHCN groups, and recently I was absolutely amazed by one of the DVR counselors in the CYSHCN with what she shared with the providers and the school districts in this particular CYSHCN that she's been doing during the pandemic and what she normally does, including discussing with her school she's assigned to Indicator 14 and helping the schools. And there was one a school representative who has, I think, 3 or 4 different high schools,
Okay.
and said their experience is much different. Some of the high schools are well, their counselors well immersed and knows the staff. So I am wondering if in the efforts that DPI is doing, is if there could be, collaborative work with the DVR to be looking at these, what are these models and who's doing things really well? And could that be replicated so that everyone in the state is treated equally in terms of opportunity? And I'm not just talking our 18 to 21 year olds, but our high school students, because it seems like there's inequities. And how do we replicate what this counselor and certainly several others are doing so that everybody has equal opportunity to parents and students?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's not an uncommon comment that I've heard. And a lot of that really just has to do with education. DVR is a large agency, just like we are, and working towards having common, consistent education and training for all VR counselors working with high school students, I think is a critical priority for DPI, for DVR, and even for DHS as well. And so some examples I can give you of how we're working on that. So we have a law in Wisconsin called the Employment First Law, or it's Act 178. And that law requires the 3 agencies to collaborate in a joint and formal way on improving employment outcomes for people with disabilities in Wisconsin. And so currently, sometimes we call that work the CIE work, or Competitive Integrated Employment, because that's what we're working towards. That group is currently rewriting the next joint plan, because every 2 years we have to rewrite a plan and it aligns with the budget and we have to submit it to the legislature, very bureaucratic things. But the things I can tell you that we're starting to draft and talk about in that plan and those conversations is that we have heard more about that gap for some counselors and that there's a need for consistent education and training. And so those conversations are happening right now at the state level on how can we provide consistent training to every VR counselor in Wisconsin. And so there are plans in the works There are grant proposals in the works. There are things coming. That CIE plan will be available for public comment here in a couple months. So I'll post the website here in a minute on where you can provide public comment and see what the state agencies are proposing to address. Like, that need for sure is on the list, and among other things, but yeah.
That just strikes me. One of the things as I began this work over, over a decade ago now, Alicia, is learning the role of these different agencies and the fact that the state, like in the case of DVR, is the state has trainers, the state has standards, but then the farther away you get from the state, then it gets a little murkier and a little murkier and a little murkier. And so sometimes somebody has to let the state know that, out wherever, that's not what's happening. And the people that I talk to at the state level want to know that. Just like when I talk to people at DPI, they're not necessarily in charge of local schools, but they set policies, they set recommendations, and they want to know when things aren't going the way they think they're going.
Yeah.
Is because they, like with this memo, is you should be being notified about any additional services and not. And if that's not happening, they want to know it's not happening.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think you bring up a really great point, Tim, that I probably missed in responding to Deb's question. Is the other thing I would encourage that person to do who's sharing their experience and the difference between their support from their VR counselor at one high school versus another in a community or in a school district is get a hold of the administrator. In the DVR works in something called WDAs. I'm going to forget what the acronym it is, but it's how they organize their counselors. Whoever the supervisor is wants to know that, wants to know that there is a need for education and growth and for their counselors to be on the same page in their region. So.
I love that, and sometimes we feel bad about, taking it up but everybody wants consistency.
No one should ever
for
feel
our
bad
families.
about that.
Right. Is we want those organizations exist to provide these services for our families. And so it should be done in a fair and equitable way.
When I'm in the field and I'll be at a conference and somebody will say that to me and I'll say, what school district do you work in? And I'll look up what WDA they work in and send that supervisor an email and say, I'd love for you to address this with the counselor assigned to this school district. Done.
Right? You don't need to know the name of the parent. You don't need to know the name of the counselor. But you know what? This is some misinformation that's coming out from this source that we would like corrected.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Any other questions? I am not seeing any unmutes, hands up, or anything going into the chat. So I think we're at the point in the conversation where I get to thank you. And I do thank you. I thank you for the work. You know how I feel about Transition Improvement Grant, and I love working with all the people over there. And with, like you said, WISPy, there's some fantastic people out there. But I really do appreciate you taking your time out to come and help teach us a little bit more about what's in this memo and crossing that bridge from education into also families. Why does this interest families? So I really do appreciate Alicia. And which, by the way, brings me up. Okay. Are you Alicia? For the first time I'm ever going to ask you, how do you pronounce your first name?
You always get it right, Tim. It's Alicia.
Alicia. Okay, very good. Well, if you want to hold on just 1 second, I'm going to stop the recording. And then if anybody wants to have a off-network conversation, I'm more than happy to hang out for a little while as well. So thank you all very much for joining us. And thank you, Alicia.